Most people think South Park just gets away with everything. Comedy Central lets it mock anyone, anytime, no consequences. But 5 episodes never made the streaming cut, one country erased the show completely, and a real death threat once silenced the show's own creators mid-broadcast. In this video, we break down every banned South Park episode. Super Best Friends, Season 5, Episode 3, 2001. South Park aired its 3rd episode of Season 5 on July 4th, 2001. The episode was called Super Best Friends. At the time, nobody thought much of it. No protests followed, no network memos got written about it. It played on television, it aired again in reruns for years afterward, and it sat quietly in the show's back catalog as one of hundreds of episodes nobody was watching with a magnifying glass. That changed almost a decade later, and the change had nothing to do with anything in this specific episode itself. The plot centers on Stan Marsh and his growing concern about a magician named David Blaine. In the world of the show, Blaine arrives in South Park performing stunts that pull people in. Stan watches his friends, and eventually most of the town fall under Blaine's spell, treating him less like an entertainer and more like a figure worth worshipping. Stan becomes convinced that something is wrong, that what looks like harmless magic is actually a con built to control people, and he sets out to prove it. The episode plays this out as parody. It borrows the structure of a cult story, the kind where a charismatic leader gathers followers through spectacle rather than substance, and it applies that structure to a real magician who was, at the time, one of the most talked about performers in the country. To fight back, Stan turns to a group called the Super Best Friends. This team is built as a direct parody of the Super Friends, an older animated superhero team made up of DC Comics characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Instead of superheroes, the South Park version assembles a team of religious and spiritual figures. The lineup includes Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, Krishna, Lao Tzu, and an original invented character called Seaman. Each of these figures, aside from Seaman, is drawn from a real-world religious tradition, and the episode leans on the basic public image most people already hold of each one to build its jokes. Jesus had already been a fixture on South Park since the show's earliest episodes, appearing as a semi-regular character with his own public access show within the town. Using him in a team-up storyline was not new ground for the series. Buddha is the central spiritual teacher of Buddhism, a tradition with roots that trace back roughly 2,500 years to the historical figure Siddhartha Gautama, who taught a path toward enlightenment through meditation and detachment from suffering. Moses is a central figure in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, known in religious texts as the leader who guided people out of slavery in Egypt and received religious law on Mount Sinai. Muhammad is considered by Muslims to be the final prophet in Islam, the person through whom the Quran was revealed. Joseph Smith founded the Latter-day Saint movement in the United States in the early 1800s, and his followers make up what is commonly known today as the Mormon Church. Krishna is one of the most widely worshipped deities in Hinduism, often depicted in ancient texts as a teacher and divine figure central to stories like the Bhagavad Gita. Lao Tzu is traditionally credited as the founder of Taoism and the author of the Tao Te Ching, an ancient Chinese text on living in harmony with the natural order. Putting all of these figures on one animated team was in itself a fairly bold creative swing for a show that was still building its identity in 2001. South Park had been on the air for 4 full seasons by that point, and it had already built a reputation for going after subjects most television avoided. Religion had been part of that from very early on, mostly through the recurring character of Jesus and through episodes that poked at organized belief systems in general. Super Best Friends pushed that further by putting several major world religions side by side in the same cartoon frame, using each figure as a kind of costume for a joke rather than making any specific one the target of the episode's satire. The actual target as the story plays out is Blaine and the behavior of the people following him, not the religious figures themselves. At no point during the episode's original broadcast or in the years of reruns that followed did this lineup generate any organized backlash. There was no public complaint tied to the release, there was no religious organization asking for the episode to be pulled. It aired as a fairly typical episode of the show's 5th season, sandwiched between other storylines, and it moved into the same rotation as the rest of the series without any special handling. Understanding why it was treated so differently later requires looking outside the episode itself. In the years following its original release, the world's relationship to depictions of Muhammad changed sharply. A set of cartoons published in a Danish newspaper in 2005 sparked global protests, diplomatic disputes, and violent unrest in multiple countries. Those cartoons were not made by South Park and had nothing to do with the show, but the reaction to them shifted how networks and media companies around the world approached any image of Muhammad going forward. What had been treated as a normal creative choice in 2001 became, in the years years after 2005, something broadcasters started handling with real caution. Comedy Central was no exception, and by the middle of the decade, the network had begun applying much tighter rules to how the show could depict Muhammad in any new material. This shift did not immediately reach backward to affect Super Best Friends. For years after 2005, the episode kept airing, since it had already been produced and released well before the new caution took hold. The turning point came in 2010, tied to two later episodes of the show, titled 200 and 201, which will be covered later in this rundown. Those two episodes triggered a serious and specific threat connected to the show's depiction of Muhammad, one that Comedy Central's own leadership at the time treated as credible enough to justify sweeping changes. Once that happened, the network did not just adjust how future episodes would handle the subject. It went back through the entire South Park library and pulled every episode containing a depiction of Muhammad, including this one from 2001, out of rotation entirely. That decision is why Super Best Friends carries the reputation it has today. It is not that the episode itself caused outrage when it was made. It is that a policy built years later, in response to events that had nothing to do with this specific broadcast, was applied to it after the fact. The episode became one of 5 that Comedy Central would no longer air, and one of 5 that would later be left out of the show's move to streaming platforms entirely. David Blaine, the real performer the episode is built around, was already a major figure in American pop culture by 2001. He was born in Brooklyn in 1973 and became interested in magic as a young child after seeing a street performer doing card tricks in a subway station. His first television special, called Street Magic, aired on ABC in 1997 and became an immediate ratings success, introducing audiences to a new style of magic built around approaching ordinary people on sidewalks and performing tricks for their genuine, unscripted reactions rather than performing on a traditional stage in front of a seated audience. A second special, called Magic Man, followed in 1998, expanding this same street style into different settings around the world. Blaine then moved beyond simple card tricks and into a series of large-scale endurance stunts that turned him into a much bigger cultural figure than a typical magician. In April of 1999, he had himself sealed inside an underground container beneath a 3-ton tank of water in New York City for 7 days, a stunt called Buried Alive that drew large crowds and heavy news coverage when he was finally lifted out. In November of 2000, he performed a stunt called Frozen in Time, standing encased in a large block of ice in the middle of Times Square for roughly 3 days, an event that drew close to 1 million spectators to see him step out once the ice was finally cut away. These stunts moved Blaine out of the world of ordinary magic acts and into something closer to a national spectacle, with television specials, front-page news coverage, and constant public conversation about what he might attempt next. By using him as the episode's central figure, South Park was tapping into someone who was, at that exact moment, one of the most recognizable entertainers in the country. The episode's premise that people were treating a magician like a cult leader worked as satire precisely because Blaine's real fame had reached a level where that comparison felt at least plausible enough to be funny. A performer capable of drawing hundreds of thousands of people to watch him stand in ice or sit buried underground was, in a very real sense, already commanding the kind of devoted public attention that made the show's cult comparison land as satire rather than pure exaggeration. The episode also fits into a broader pattern found across South Park's early seasons, one where the show would take something happening in mainstream culture at that exact moment and run it through a ridiculous, exaggerated lens. Cult behavior, mass devotion to celebrities, and the psychology of groupthink were all subjects the show returned to repeatedly during this stretch of its run. Super Best Friends slots into that pattern cleanly. It is less an episode about religion and more an episode about the mechanics of blind belief, using religious figures as an unlikely toolkit to fight back against exactly that kind of blind belief in a magician. For years, this episode existed in Comedy Central's rotation without any special notes attached to it. It was included in home video releases of the show's 5th season, appearing on both DVD and Blu-ray box sets in its complete unedited form. That version, uncut and unaltered from its original broadcast, remains something fans can access today through those physical releases. What changed was its digital footprint. When South Park moved from HBO Max to Paramount Plus in 2025, Super Best Friends did not make the transition. It joined 4 other episodes left out of the new streaming home entirely, all 5 connected by the same underlying reason. Each one includes Muhammad in some form, and Comedy Central's post-2010 policy treats all of them the same way, regardless of how each one was originally received. It is worth being precise about what kind of episode this actually was, before any of that history attached itself to it. On its own terms, without the later context, Super Best Friends is a fairly straightforward parody episode. It borrows borrows a familiar cartoon format, the team-up special, and fills it with an unexpected cast. It uses religious figures as functional characters within a plot, rather than as the subject of religious commentary. Its jokes are aimed at cult psychology and celebrity worship, using the real-life fame of David Blaine as its anchor point. None of that reads on its own as an episode built to provoke outrage. The outrage it eventually became associated with arrived nearly a decade later, attached from the outside, based on decisions made in response to a completely different set of episodes. This gap between how an episode is made and how it eventually gets treated says something worth sitting with about how banned status actually works on this show. It is rarely about the content of the episode alone. It is often about timing, about what happens years after release, and about how networks respond to threats that may have nothing to do with the specific broadcast in question. Super Best Friends is proof that an episode can air peacefully for almost a decade and still end up locked away, not because anyone changed their mind about it, but because the world around it changed instead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next entry in this history moves the timeline forward 5 years, into 2006, when the show stopped dealing with reactions to old material and instead walked directly into a new controversy of its own making, one built specifically around the exact same question this episode had quietly avoided. Section 2, Cartoon Wars, Part 1, Season 10, Episode 3, 2006. South Park entered its 10th season in 2006, already established as one of the longest-running and most talked-about shows on cable television. By this point, the series had been on the air for 9 full years, had survived multiple shifts in cultural mood, and had built a reputation for walking directly into subjects other shows avoided. Season 10's third episode, titled Cartoon Wars Part 1, would go on to become one of the most important episodes in the show's history, not because of what it showed, but because of what it deliberately chose not to show, and the reasoning it built around that choice. The episode's plot begins with a simple premise. Word spreads through South Park that the animated show Family Guy is planning to air an episode containing an image of the Prophet Muhammad. This sets off panic among the adults in town, who become convinced that the broadcast will provoke a violent response from extremist groups somewhere in the world. The fear is not really about Muhammad himself. It is about what people believe other people might do in reaction to seeing him drawn on screen. Cartman, sensing an opportunity, positions himself as a defender of public safety and tries to get the episode pulled from air, while Kyle pushes back, arguing that giving into that fear sets a dangerous precedent for what television is and is not allowed to say. This setup was not built in a vacuum. It was a direct response to real events that had unfolded across the world just 1 year earlier. In September of 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published a set of 12 cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, an act considered deeply offensive by many practicing Muslims, since Islamic tradition generally holds that depicting Muhammad in any image is forbidden. The publication of these cartoons was not an isolated media event. It triggered a chain reaction across the globe. Protests broke out in dozens of countries. Danish embassies were attacked in several nations. Diplomatic relationships between Denmark and multiple Muslim-majority countries became strained for months afterward. Boycotts of Danish goods spread through parts of the Middle East. In several cities, the protests over the cartoons turned violent, resulting in deaths during clashes between demonstrators and police. This entire sequence of events, now generally referred to as the Danish cartoon controversy, became one of the defining international news stories of that period, and it fundamentally changed how media organizations around the world thought about publishing or broadcasting any image of Muhammad going forward. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, watched this entire situation unfold, and saw in it a subject that fit perfectly within the kind of satire their show had built its identity on. South Park had never been shy about pointing a camera at media cowardice, at hypocrisy, and at the gap between what people claim to believe and how they actually behave when real pressure shows up. The Danish cartoon controversy offered all three of those things at once. It showed newspapers and broadcasters around the world debating, often in public, whether they had the courage to reprint the cartoons themselves in the name of press freedom, and in most cases deciding that they did not. Parker and Stone built Cartoon Wars Part 1 as a direct commentary on that hesitation, using their own show's parody universe to test the exact same question that real newsrooms had been quietly avoiding for the past year. The choice to route the story through Family Guy rather than through South Park itself was a deliberate structural decision, and it served more than one purpose. On one level, it let Parker and Stone poke fun at Family Guy directly, a show they had been openly critical critical of for years, often mocking its style of comedy as a series of disconnected pop culture references strung together without the kind of narrative or character logic that South Park prided itself on building instead. Using Family Guy as the vehicle for the Muhammad storyline let the episode land two jokes at once, one aimed at network cowardice around religious depictions, and one aimed at what Parker and Stone saw as lazy writing in a rival show. On another level, routing the controversy through a fictional broadcast happening within the story rather than directly through South Park's own narration gave the episode a layer of distance that let it discuss the underlying issue without immediately forcing Comedy Central to make the exact same decision the story was built around. That distance would not last through the second half of the story. Family Guy, for context, is an animated sitcom created by Seth MacFarlane that first aired in 1999, centered on the Griffin family in the fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island. The show built its comedic identity around a heavy use of cutaway gags, short unrelated scenes that interrupt the main plot to deliver a joke before returning to the story. By 2006, Family Guy had become a major rating success for Fox, having survived an earlier cancellation in 2002 and returned to air in 2005, partly due to strong DVD sales and reruns that built a large audience during its time off the air. Its dominant place in the world of adult animated comedy made it a natural rival for South Park to reference, since both shows were competing for a similar audience and a similar cultural space within the genre. Within the story of Cartoon Wars Part 1, the panic in South Park escalates as the town becomes convinced that Family Guy airing an image of Muhammad will lead to a terrorist attack somewhere in the country. Cartman uses this fear to manipulate the town into supporting a plan to stop the broadcast, while pretending his real motivation is public safety rather than what is actually driving him, which is a long-running personal grudge against Kyle and a desire to prove Family Guy is a bad show built on cheap writing rather than genuine comedy. Kyle, meanwhile, becomes the voice arguing that pulling the episode over fear of violence is exactly the wrong response, since it rewards the people making threats and teaches media companies that threats work. This tension between Cartman's fear-based argument and Kyle's free speech argument forms the emotional spine of the episode, and it sets up the second half of the story, which aired the following week as Cartoon Wars Part 2, where the conflict comes to a head. What makes this episode particularly significant in the history of the show is not just its content, but the timing of its production relative to the real-world events still unfolding around it. The Danish cartoon controversy was still generating diplomatic fallout when this episode went into production, meaning Parker and Stone were writing satire about an ongoing situation rather than a settled piece of history. This gave the episode an unusually sharp edge, since the exact behavior it was mocking, media organizations calculating how much risk they were willing to take before backing down, was still actively playing out in real newsrooms at the same time the episode aired. Comedy Central's own handling of this episode became part of the story almost immediately, and this is where the situation grows more complicated than a simple case of a network airing a controversial script without interference. While Cartoon Wars Part 1 itself does not depict Muhammad directly, since the actual image was reserved for Part 2, the network was already aware of where the two-part story was heading, and internal discussions about how to handle the eventual depiction were already underway by the time this first episode aired. The show's writers had originally intended for the second episode to include an actual visual of Muhammad appearing on screen during the fictional Family Guy broadcast within the story. Comedy Central leadership, weighing the real-world tension still surrounding any depiction of Muhammad at that moment, made the decision to block that image from being shown, a decision that would define the second half of the story in a way the writers had not originally planned. This is a detail worth sitting inside for a moment, because it captures something important about how these two episodes function together as a single piece of satire. The story Parker and Stone had originally written was itself a piece of fiction about a network being too afraid to air an image of Muhammad. Comedy Central then made the real-world decision to censor that exact same image within their own broadcast of the episode, meaning the network's actual behavior ended up mirroring the fictional cowardice the episode was built to mock. The show was writing satire about media censorship, and in the process of airing that satire, became a real example of the very thing it was satirizing. This layered irony is part of why Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2 are remembered as such a pivotal moment in the show's history, since the behind-the-scenes story of how the episodes were handled ended up saying almost as much as the episodes themselves. Doug Herzog, who served as president of Comedy Central at the time, became a central figure in the public conversation that followed. Parker and Stone were open about their frustration with the network's decision to block the planned depiction, and Herzog addressed addressed the situation publicly afterward, describing the choice as a difficult one that he stood behind as the right call given the circumstances at the time. This exchange between the show's creators and network leadership was unusually public for a dispute of this kind, and it added another layer to how the episode was received, since audiences were not just watching a story about censorship, they were also watching a real dispute over censorship play out in interviews and statements happening at the same time the episodes were airing. Cartoon Wars Part 1 originally aired on April 5th, 2006, as part of the show's 10th season. It has since become one of 5 South Park episodes that Comedy Central does not air in reruns, and that were not included when the show moved its full library over to streaming platforms, first through Hulu, and later through HBO Max, and now through Paramount+. The episode remains available through physical media, having been included on the Season 10 DVD and Blu-ray box sets, where it can still be watched in its originally aired form. Beyond its place in the show's censorship history, Cartoon Wars Part 1 is also notable for how directly it engages with the mechanics of fear-based decision-making within media companies, a subject South Park would return to repeatedly throughout its run. The episode does not simply argue that censorship is wrong in the abstract. It builds a detailed case study of exactly how censorship happens in practice, showing a chain of people each making a small, individually reasonable-sounding decision driven by fear of what might happen if they do not, until those small decisions add up to a complete retreat from an idea that nobody directly attacked in the first place. This structure, small individual choices building into a larger collective failure of nerve, gives the episode a shape that holds up as commentary well beyond the specific 2006 controversy it was originally responding to. The episode also marks a turning point in how directly South Park was willing to engage with its own industry. Earlier seasons of the show had certainly criticized celebrities, politicians, and public figures, but Cartoon Wars Part 1 turned its attention specifically toward the television business itself, examining how networks make decisions under pressure and what those decisions reveal about the values driving an entire industry. This kind of industry-facing satire would become a recurring tool for Parker and Stone in the years that followed, and this episode stands as one of the clearest early examples of the show using its own medium as the actual subject of its commentary, rather than aiming its satire purely outward at the wider culture. The story does not resolve within this first episode. The town's panic over the Family Guy broadcast is still unfolding when the episode ends, and Cartman's manipulation of the situation for his own personal reasons has not yet been fully exposed. The actual confrontation between fear and principle, along with the moment where the show's own broadcast decisions collided directly with the fictional story being told, was still to come. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That collision arrives in the very next chapter of this same story, where the argument stops being theoretical, the censorship becomes real rather than fictional, and the consequences of the decision made behind the scenes finally reach the screen itself. Section 3, Cartoon Wars Part 2, Season 10, Episode 4, 2006. Cartoon Wars Part 2 aired on April 12, 2006, 1 week after the first half of the story set up its central conflict. This second episode is where the argument stops being theoretical and the show's own broadcast decisions become part of the story it was already telling. What began as a fictional debate about whether a rival network should air an image of Muhammad turned, by the time this episode reached air, into a real debate about whether South Park's own network would allow the same thing, playing out in front of the same audience watching the fictional version unfold. The episode picks up with Cartman fully committed to his mission of stopping Family Guy from airing its planned Muhammad episode. Rather than staying in South Park to keep arguing with Kyle, Cartman travels to Los Angeles, heading directly to the Fox studio lot where Family Guy is produced. This trip forms the backbone of the episode's main plot and gives Parker and Stone room to build one of the most pointed pieces of industry satire in the show's history up to that point. Before Cartman even reaches the studio, the episode plays a joke on its own audience that had, by this point, become something of a running tradition on the show. As the episode opens, an announcement interrupts the story to inform viewers that the conclusion of Cartoon Wars will not be shown that night, and that a special episode of Terrence and Phillip will air in its place instead. This same prank, pretending to pull an episode viewers had been waiting a full week for, had been played once before on the show's own audience years earlier, and it returns here as a small piece of self-aware humor sitting right at the start of an episode that is, at its core, entirely about the real possibility of an episode getting pulled. The Terrence and Phillip segment that briefly plays in place of the real story includes its own small joke tied directly to the episode's larger subject. Terrence and and Philip are shown working alongside a version of Muhammad who appears with his image blacked out, and upon noticing this censorship themselves, the two characters travel to the fictional Canadian Broadcasting Corporation to demand the episode be rerun without the censorship applied. This short detour gives the episode a second, smaller example of exactly the same institutional caution the main story is built around, layering the joke about censorship into more than one corner of the same half hour. Once Cartman actually arrives at the Fox studio lot, he does not head straight to network executives. He first encounters a young boy at the studio who closely resembles Bart Simpson, a character from the long-running animated series The Simpsons, and the two children strike up a partnership before Cartman moves further into the building. Kyle, left stranded on the side of the road by Cartman earlier in the episode, eventually reaches a diner along the way to Los Angeles, where he finds every person inside sitting with their heads literally buried in sand pits, a visual joke built around the idea of people willfully avoiding an uncomfortable news story rather than confronting it directly. Cartman eventually reaches the Fox executives and adopts a disguise for the occasion, presenting himself under a false identity as a young boy from Denmark whose father was supposedly killed as a direct result of a Danish newspaper publishing an image of Muhammad, a detail drawing straight from the real Jyllands-Posten cartoon controversy that had unfolded just months earlier. Using this fabricated personal tragedy, Cartman convinces the Fox executives that pulling the Family Guy episode is the only responsible choice, moving them enough that they ask him to make his case directly to the people actually responsible for writing the show. This is where Cartman makes his way into what is presented as the actual writer's room for Family Guy. What he finds there is not a room full of comedy writers at all. Instead, the show depicts a tank filled with manatees, each one pushing a floating idea ball into a chute. Each of these balls carries a single word printed on it, sometimes a noun, sometimes a verb, sometimes a specific pop culture reference. The manatees push 5 balls at a time into a machine that combines whatever 5 words happen to land together into a finished cutaway joke for the show. One example described within the episode shows the words laundry, date, winning, Mexico, and the name Gary Coleman being combined into a scene of Lois asking Peter to do the laundry, which triggers Peter recalling an unrelated memory of winning a date in Mexico with the actor Gary Coleman. The sequence is built to look mechanical and arbitrary, rather than clever or intentional, presenting the entire creative process behind the show's humor as something closer to chance than to craft. A Fox staff member explains an additional detail of how this system works to Cartman while he tours the facility. The manatees, according to this explanation, refuse to work entirely if a single idea ball is ever removed from their tank, since doing so signals to them that some subject has been ruled off limits, and their worldview holds that if one subject cannot be joked about, then no subject can be joked about either. This detail gives the manatees an oddly principled quality within the joke, framing them, despite being the punchline of the entire segment, as somehow more consistent in their approach to free expression than the human executives making decisions around them. The same staff member also tells Cartman that manatees are the only mammals completely unaffected by the threat of terrorism, a small aside that reinforces the episode's larger point about fear driving decisions that have nothing to do with the actual content in question. This entire manatee sequence was Parker and Stone's way of making a specific argument about Family Guy that they had discussed openly in interviews for years before this episode aired. Their criticism of the show centered on its heavy use of cutaway gags, short scenes that break away from the main plot to deliver an unrelated joke before returning to the story. Parker and Stone had long argued that this style of comedy did not require the same kind of narrative connection or character logic that a joke embedded naturally inside a story does. By showing the writing process as literally random, generated by animals pushing balls into a machine rather than by writers building a joke with any specific meaning, the episode makes its case visually rather than through dialogue, letting the joke about Family Guy's structure double as the actual structure of this section of the episode. Notably, the writers behind the real Family Guy later addressed this joke directly during commentary released on one of their own DVD box sets, acknowledging that the show's practice of moving jokes and segments around between episodes when one ran too long bore some resemblance to what South Park was mocking, and the term manatee joke has since been used informally by some Family Guy staff themselves to describe a cutaway gag. Cartman secretly removes a single idea ball from the manatee tank, causing the animals to stop working entirely, exactly as the earlier explanation predicted. He then returns to the Fox executives and argues that letting a tank of animals dictate network programming decisions makes the studio look weak, convincing them that pulling the Family Guy episode is the only way to reassert control. The president of Fox, worn down by Cartman's manipulation, ultimately agrees to pull the episode just before it is scheduled to air. While Cartman explores the manatee tank and continues plotting to stop the broadcast, the story back in South Park continues developing the argument Kyle had been building since the first episode. Kyle eventually manages to escape from being held by the Bart-like boy Cartman partnered with earlier, doing so by talking the boy through the same kind of reasoning Kyle has used against Cartman throughout the two-part story, warning him that continuing down this path would turn him into someone just as dangerous as Cartman himself. Freed, Kyle makes his way to the Fox executives just as Cartman is preparing to celebrate his apparent victory, and delivers a direct appeal urging them not to pull the episode. His argument centers on the idea that giving into fear, whether that fear is about violence, backlash, or controversy, teaches the people making threats that the strategy works, and that once a network demonstrates it will back down under pressure, it invites more pressure rather than less. Parker has said in commentary that this speech was drawn almost directly from real conversations he and Stone were having with Comedy Central executives during the making of these episodes, right down to Kyle addressing the fictional network president by the first name Doug, a direct reference to the real Comedy Central president, Doug Herzog, at the time. The Fox president in the story ultimately sides with Kyle rather than Cartman, deciding to let the Family Guy episode air uncensored despite the pressure both from Cartman's manipulation and from a separate, more serious threat within the story involving real-world terrorist figures. This decision within the fictional Fox storyline stands in direct and deliberate contrast to what actually happened at Comedy Central during the making of this same episode, since South Park's own network chose the opposite path just moments later within the same broadcast. The episode builds toward a moment where the actual content of the planned Muhammad cutaway is finally revealed to the audience, and this reveal is where the story makes its sharpest point. The scene that Family Guy is supposedly planning to air, and that has caused the entire town to panic throughout both episodes, turns out to be almost nothing. Within the fictional Family Guy broadcast, Muhammad appears handing a football helmet, described in the episode as a salmon-colored helmet, to the character Peter Griffin. A simple, unremarkable action that carries no insult, mockery, or disrespect of any kind. The joke of the two-part story is built entirely around this gap between the fear surrounding the idea of showing Muhammad and the actual harmlessness of what was going to be shown. Set against this, the same fictional Family Guy broadcast includes a separate segment showing a crude, deliberately offensive cartoon created by real-world terrorist figures referenced within the story, including a depiction credited to Ayman al-Zawahiri in retaliation for the Muhammad cutaway airing at all. This retaliatory cartoon within the story shows President George W. Bush, television personality Carson Kressley, actor Tom Cruise, actress Katie Holmes, and Jesus Christ depicted defecating on one another and on the American flag, a segment treated by the terrorist figure within the story as a devastating counterattack. By placing a genuinely harmless Muhammad depiction next to genuinely crude and disrespectful treatment of several other real public figures and a major religious figure from a different tradition, the episode makes its argument through contrast rather than through a stated thesis. The point being made is that the actual content of a depiction was never really the issue. The issue was fear of a specific and violent reaction, a fear that applied only to one religious figure and not to any of the others being mocked in the same broadcast. This is where the episode's own real-world broadcast history becomes inseparable from its fictional story. Comedy Central had already made the decision, discussed during the production of the first episode, to prevent any actual depiction of Muhammad from airing on South Park itself, regardless of how the story required it. When this episode reached the moment where the mundane Muhammad scene was supposed to appear on screen, viewers did not see it. Instead, the network replaced the image with a black screen accompanied by a title card stating plainly that Comedy Central had refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on its network, describing in text form the exact harmless action, a football helmet being handed over, that the missing footage would have shown. This card appeared at the exact moment the story had spent 2 full episodes building toward, meaning the real censorship decision landed directly inside the fictional argument about censorship, with almost no separation between the two. The effect of this was something neither a normal review nor a normal summary can fully capture without pointing directly at how unusual it was. The episode had spent its entire runtime building a case that refusing to show something out of fear, rather than out of any real problem with the content itself, was a failure of nerve dressed up as caution. Then, at the precise moment the story called for that exact kind of image, the network airing the episode made that exact same choice, in real time, live, in front of the audience. Parker and Stone did not have to argue that this was hypocritical or self-defeating. The broadcast made the argument by itself, since the thing being described in the story and the thing actually happening on screen became the same event. Kyle delivers a closing speech near the end of the episode that directly addresses this outcome. Rather than framing the situation as a simple win or loss, Kyle's speech argues that South Park had, in its own way, failed the same test it had spent 2 episodes accusing others of failing. The speech does not celebrate any kind of victory. It acknowledges that fear had won, that the network had made the same choice out of caution that Cartman had been pushing for out of manipulation, and that the difference between doing the right thing for the right reason and doing the wrong thing out of fear had collapsed into the same outcome regardless of the intention behind it. This speech aired without being cut or censored, meaning the show was allowed to openly criticize the exact decision the network had just made only moments earlier within the same broadcast. Cartman's actual motivation throughout the 2-part story is revealed to have very little to do with public safety at all. His stated concern from the beginning of part 1 was that Muhammad appearing on Family Guy could provoke a violent reaction somewhere in the world. By the end of part 2, it becomes clear that this concern was never Cartman's real driving force. His actual goal was to prove that Family Guy was a badly written show that succeeded through cheap and lazy comedy rather than genuine skill, and stopping the broadcast was simply a tool for winning a long-running argument with Kyle rather than a genuine safety concern. This reveal reframes everything that came before it, turning what looked like a story about religious sensitivity into a story about a much smaller and much more personal grudge, one that had simply used a much larger fear as cover. The episode's final joke underlines this same idea from a different angle. After all the buildup around what Family Guy was supposedly going to show, and after the real censorship interrupted the moment the story had been building toward, the episode closes by pointing out that the entire controversy had been driven by expectation and fear, rather than by anything that actually happened on screen. The thing everyone spent 2 episodes afraid of turned out to be nothing at all, and the actual censorship came not from the content itself, but from the pattern of caution that had built up around the mere idea of that content existing. Doug Herzog, the president of Comedy Central at the time these episodes aired, addressed the network's decision to block the Muhammad image directly in the aftermath. A statement released by Comedy Central the day after this episode aired described the decision as the right one given recent world events, a clear reference to the ongoing global fallout still surrounding the Danish cartoon controversy at that time. Parker and Stone were open about their frustration with how the decision unfolded, having originally intended for the mundane Muhammad scene to air exactly as written, without the black screen replacing it. According to accounts the 2 creators have given since, Comedy Central and its parent company Viacom had initially been hesitant, but not entirely opposed to the idea of the episode depicting Muhammad, given how valuable the show remained to the network financially, before executives at a higher level within Viacom ultimately overruled that initial openness and blocked the image from airing. The dispute between the show's creators and the network became part of the public conversation surrounding the episode almost immediately, adding a layer of real-world tension to a story that was already built entirely around that same tension. Much of Parker and Stone's frustration traced directly back to the fact that Muhammad had already appeared, fully visible and without any censorship at all, in Super Best Friends 5 years earlier, an episode that aired repeatedly on Comedy Central and in syndication for years without any network objection at the time. The 2 creators have said that reconciling this earlier uncensored appearance with the network's sudden new caution around the same figure was part of what made the situation feel so difficult to accept, and part of why they were determined to find some way to represent Comedy Central's refusal honestly on screen, rather than simply cutting the scene quietly and moving on as though nothing had happened. Cartoon Wars Part 2 has since become recognized as one of the most important entries in South Park's entire run, not simply because of its content, but because of how directly its production history and its actual story became the same thing. Very few television episodes have managed to make an argument about censorship and then have that exact argument proven correct by the network airing it, within the same 30 minutes, without any gap between the fictional warning and the real-world confirmation of it. This quality is a large part of why the episode continues to be studied and referenced whenever conversations about media caution, religious depiction, and network decision-making come up, even outside the context of South Park itself. Critics at the time generally responded positively to the episode, and much of the immediate press coverage surrounding its release focused as heavily on its sustained mockery of Family Guy's writing style as it did on the censorship itself, giving the episode a dual legacy as both a landmark moment in the show's history with religious satire and one of its most direct attacks on a rival program. Both Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2 were included in the show's 10th season DVD and Blu-ray releases, where they remain available available in their originally aired form, black screen and all, exactly as broadcast in April of 2006. Neither episode made the transition when South Park moved its full library to streaming, first through Hulu, later through HBO Max, and now through Paramount+. Both episodes sit alongside Super Best Friends as 3 of the 5 total episodes the show has effectively lost from its digital footprint, each one connected by the same underlying reason: a depiction of Muhammad considered too great a risk to carry forward into modern distribution, regardless of how mundane or how central that depiction actually was to the story being told. The 2-part story also marks a turning point in how South Park approached controversial subjects going forward. Before 2006, the show had built a reputation for being willing to mock nearly anything without much apparent hesitation. After the real-world fallout from these 2 episodes, including the direct network censorship and the broader wave of concern surrounding any future depiction of Muhammad, the show noticeably pulled back from testing that specific boundary again in the same direct way. This shift did not mean the show became less willing to provoke reaction on other subjects, but it did mark the end of a period where Muhammad specifically could appear as a character the way he had in Super Best Friends and in the mundane cutaway scene central to this story. What happened with these 2 episodes effectively closed that door for the remainder of the show's run. Even the episode's original scheduling reflects how much tension had already built up behind the scenes before a single frame of Cartoon Wars ever aired. Parker and Stone had originally intended these 2 episodes to open South Park's entire 10th season, but Comedy Central's continued hesitation over the Muhammad depiction forced the story to be delayed until later in the season instead. Season 10 opened instead with an unrelated episode dealing with the departure of a different cast member from the show, while Parker and Stone continued negotiating with the network behind the scenes over what Cartoon Wars would ultimately be allowed to show. Splitting the story into 2 separate episodes rather than telling it in the single half hour as originally planned gave both sides an extra week to keep negotiating, a detail Parker addressed directly at the time, noting that the ongoing disagreement over the Muhammad depiction was itself part of the reason the story needed the additional space to unfold. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story that began with these 2 episodes does not end in 2006. It ties directly into the 200th episode of the show 4 years later, when Parker and Stone would return to this exact same subject on a much larger scale, revisiting many of the same characters and tensions raised here, only this time facing consequences far more serious than a black screen and a title card. Section 4, 200, Season 14, Episode 5, 2010. South Park aired its 200th episode on April 14th, 2010, as the 5th episode of Season 14. By this point, the show had been running for 13 years, longer than almost any other scripted series on American television, and Trey Parker and Matt Stone decided to mark the milestone by building an episode that pulled together nearly every celebrity and public figure the show had ever mocked across its long history. What started as a kind of victory lap to the show's own back catalog ended up becoming one of the most consequential episodes South Park has ever produced, not because of what aired, but because of what happened in the real world once people started reacting to it. The plot of 200 begins with a large group of celebrities arriving in South Park together, all of them people the show had made fun of at some point over its run. Rather than simply being annoyed, this group arrives with a plan. They inform the town that they are prepared to file a massive lawsuit against South Park unless the town helps them accomplish one specific goal, which is arranging a meeting with the prophet Muhammad. The reasoning behind this request ties back to the show's own internal mythology. Within the world of South Park, Muhammad had appeared years earlier as a member of the Super Best Friends, a team of religious figures possessing special abilities, and the celebrities in this episode believe that Muhammad holds some kind of power that could protect them from being mocked and ridiculed the way South Park had been mocking them for years. Their goal is not really about faith or religion in any personal sense. It is about wanting the same kind of protection from ridicule that they believe Muhammad's image seems to carry, given how carefully networks and media companies had started treating any depiction of him following the events of 2005 and 2006. Tom Cruise serves as the central figure leading this group throughout the episode, and the episode leans directly on an earlier South Park storyline built around him. Season 9's Trapped in the Closet had already portrayed Cruise as a figure obsessed with hiding inside a literal closet, a joke connected to long-standing rumors about his personal life. And 200 continues this same running gag, showing Cruise still preoccupied with the same fixation years later. Cruise had also already appeared as a recurring target of the show's satire in an earlier episode from 2005 that mocked him directly following his public disagreements with Brooke Shields over the the use of psychiatric medication and antidepressants, a real-world dispute that had played out in interviews and media coverage at the time. That earlier episode had reportedly upset Cruz enough that rumors circulated for years about him trying to have it pulled from circulation, although the full details of that situation were never confirmed publicly by either side in a clear or complete way. Regardless of the exact truth behind those rumors, Cruz's return in 200 as the leader of a group demanding protection from ridicule gave the episode a clear through line, connecting the show's past conflicts with celebrities directly into its 200th episode celebration. The roster of celebrities joining Cruz in this lawsuit reads as a genuine survey of the show's entire history of celebrity satire. Filmmaker Rob Reiner appears among the group, along with director Steven Spielberg, filmmaker George Lucas, actor Mel Gibson, musician Kanye West, socialite Paris Hilton, and film director Tim Burton, a figure who had never actually appeared in a South Park episode before this one, brought in specifically for the occasion and mocked within the episode for reusing the same creative ideas across his films, and for his frequent collaborations with actor Johnny Depp. Barbra Streisand also returns as part of this group, and her presence in the episode carries a layer of authenticity beyond the joke itself. Parker and Stone have said publicly, including in interviews given around this period, that unlike most celebrities they mock without any real personal feeling behind it, Streisand is someone they hold a genuine dislike toward, and Streisand herself had criticized the show in the past, arguing publicly that it added to cynicism and negativity within the culture, particularly among children. This mutual, genuine friction gave her involvement in 200 a different texture than the more good-natured ribbing given to most of the other celebrities appearing alongside her. Streisand's inclusion also ties back directly to one of the show's very first season episodes, since the plan the celebrities settle on once their demands are refused involves reactivating a giant mechanical version of Streisand, a monstrous robotic form the show had first introduced in its first season and destroyed by the end of that same episode. The celebrities in 200 decide to rebuild and reactivate this same mechanical Streisand as a way of forcing the town into compliance once ordinary threats and legal pressure fail to produce results, giving the episode a direct callback that longtime viewers of the show would have recognized immediately. The episode presents its promise to the audience early on, telling viewers that this 200th episode will finally reveal Muhammad directly on screen, something the show had not done in any new material since the events of Cartoon Wars 4 years earlier. This promise sets up the entire structure of the episode, since the story is built around the town trying to locate and produce Muhammad in order to satisfy the celebrities and avoid the lawsuit hanging over them. The tension of the episode comes from watching this search play out while the audience waits to see whether the show will actually follow through on showing him. A second faction complicates the plot considerably, a group the episode calls the Ginger Separatist Movement, made up of pale, red-haired children from within the town who have grown tired of being mocked for their appearance in earlier episodes, also demands that Muhammad be handed over to them, threatening violence against the town if their demand is not met. This creates a three-way standoff between the town of South Park, the group of celebrities led by Cruz, and this separate faction of children, each with a different reason for wanting access to Muhammad, and each willing to apply real pressure to get what they want. Kyle and Stan, working separately from the main conflict, managed to convince the Super Best Friends, the same team introduced years earlier in the 2001 episode covered earlier in this history, to allow Muhammad to travel into South Park under strict conditions, agreeing that he will remain hidden inside a moving truck and will not be shown to anyone. When the town realizes it needs to physically transport him to meet Cruz, the story shows the townspeople attempting to disguise him inside a costume, adding another layer of comic misdirection to the question of whether Muhammad will actually be seen at all before the episode ends. What audiences actually saw when 200 aired involved a level of confusion that became part of the episode's own legacy. Muhammad does appear within the story, but Comedy Central made the decision to obscure his image using a black censor box placed over him whenever he appeared on screen, alongside a label reading "Censored." This was a decision made by the network rather than by Parker and Stone, and it meant that even though the character was present and active within the plot, viewers never actually saw an unobscured depiction of him during the original broadcast. The censorship covered his visual appearance but did not remove him from the story entirely, meaning audiences could follow his role in the plot while still being denied the actual image the episode's own marketing had teased. This decision by the network reflected a real and specific fear that had been building for years by the time 200 aired. Following the events of Cartoon Wars in 2006, and following the broader global tension still surrounding any depiction of Muhammad since the 2005 Danish cartoon controversy, Comedy Central had become increasingly cautious about about how the show handled this particular subject. That caution turned out to be justified almost immediately once 200 actually aired, although not in the way anyone at the network could have fully predicted ahead of time. Shortly after the episode's broadcast, a group called Revolution Muslim, a small and radical organization based in New York that had positioned itself as a fringe voice within discussions about Islam and media depictions of Muhammad, posted a message online in response to the episode. This message referenced the 2004 killing of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, who had been murdered following the release of a film he made that was considered critical of how women were treated within some interpretations of Islam. The post from Revolution Muslim suggested that Parker and Stone could face a similar fate for their handling of Muhammad in 200, listing what it claimed was the South Park studio address alongside this reference to Van Gogh's killing. The message was traced back to a specific individual, Zachary Chesser, a young man associated with Revolution Muslim who helped write and publicize the warning. Chesser was arrested by federal authorities in July of 2010, just a few months after 200 aired, while reportedly attempting to travel overseas to join a militant group operating in Somalia. He was later convicted on charges connected to soliciting violence and supporting terrorism, and he received a lengthy federal prison sentence as a result, with reports describing a term of 25 years. The broader leadership of Revolution Muslim faced legal consequences of its own in the years that followed, with the group's founder eventually pleading guilty to related charges, including using the internet to encourage violence, and receiving a separate lengthy federal prison sentence. While the group later claimed their message was intended as a warning rather than a direct threat, the message was treated as a serious and credible danger by law enforcement, by Comedy Central, and by Parker and Stone themselves, given the specific and violent nature of what it referenced. This reaction from Revolution Muslim became one of the most serious real-world consequences the show had ever faced as a result of its content. Unlike earlier controversies, which had mostly involved public criticism, boycotts, or complaints from religious and advocacy groups, this situation involved language that pointed directly toward violence and referenced an actual killing that had already happened to another creator working on a similar subject. Because of this, the situation moved beyond a normal media controversy and into something that law enforcement and network security had to take seriously as a genuine safety concern for the people involved in making the show. The episode had originally been planned as the first half of a two-part story, with the second half, titled 201, set to air the following week, and intended to resolve the plot threads left open by 200. The events following the broadcast of 200, including the message from Revolution Muslim, meant that by the time 201 was ready to air, Comedy Central was dealing with a much more serious and immediate concern than it had faced during the Cartoon Wars controversy 4 years earlier. The network's response to that second episode, and the far more extensive censorship applied to it, forms its own chapter in this story, and will be covered in detail in the section that follows this one. Within the story of 200 itself, beyond the central plot involving the celebrities and Muhammad, the episode also brings back a long-running plot thread involving Cartman, one connected to earlier storylines about his mother, in a way that ties multiple older episodes together as part of the 200th episode's larger celebration of the show's own history. This thread traces back to a pair of Season 2 episodes that first raised the question of Cartman's father, episodes that had concluded years earlier by identifying his mother as a person of dual biology, who was also, according to that storyline, his biological father. Within 200, this settled explanation is thrown back into question, with a character named Mitch Connor, a ventriloquist puppet worn on Cartman's hand and previously used earlier in the series to impersonate a real celebrity, insisting that this earlier explanation was actually a lie the town had told to protect the identity of Cartman's real father. This subplot ends the episode on a cliffhanger, with the true answer withheld until the following week's episode, giving 200 two separate unresolved storylines running side by side, one involving the international religious controversy, and one involving a much more personal, long-running joke about Cartman's own family history. Parker and Stone structured 200 specifically to function as a kind of greatest hits episode. Pulling together characters, jokes, and storylines the show had built over more than a decade, using the milestone as an opportunity to look backward at its own history at the same time it was pushing forward into new and, as it turned out, unexpectedly dangerous territory. The episode's handling of celebrity satire extends well beyond Tom Cruise and Barbra Streisand. Numerous other public figures the show had mocked over the years appear as part of the lawsuit-threatening group, each one representing a specific earlier controversy or joke from the show's back catalog. This structure meant that 200 was not simply revisiting one old joke, but was functioning as a kind of connected timeline of the show's entire relationship relationship with celebrity culture, using the milestone episode to remind the audience just how many public figures South Park had taken aim at since its debut in 1997. What makes 200 particularly significant within the larger story of South Park's banned and censored episodes is the way it combines two separate categories of controversy that had previously stayed somewhat separate. Earlier controversies involving Muhammad, such as Cartoon Wars, had centered on religious sensitivity and questions about free speech within a media and broadcasting context. Earlier controversies involving celebrities, such as the Tom Cruise episode from 2005, had centered on personal disputes between the show and specific public figures upset about how they were portrayed. 200 merged both of these threads into a single story, using celebrity anger as the engine driving the plot toward a religious controversy, and in doing so created a situation where the fallout from the episode ended up being more serious than either category of controversy had produced on its own up to that point. The episode originally aired as part of Comedy Central's regular broadcast schedule, and was, at the time, treated as a major event by the network, given its status as a milestone episode. Advertising and promotion around its release emphasized the scale of the celebration being planned, and the episode delivered on that promise by including an unusually large number of returning characters and storylines packed into a single half hour. According to figures reported by Nielsen Media Research, the original broadcast drew roughly 3.33 million viewers, making it the most watched program on cable television that particular night, a strong ratings result that reflected just how much anticipation had built around the milestone before anyone knew how the surrounding controversy would unfold. This scale is part of why the fallout that followed felt so disproportionate to what many expected going into the broadcast. An episode built as a celebration of the show's history and longevity ended up becoming one of the most serious safety concerns Parker and Stone had ever faced as a direct result of their work. Following the reaction from Revolution Muslim, Comedy Central found itself needing to make immediate decisions about how to proceed with 201, the second half of the story, which was scheduled to air just 1 week after 200. These decisions had to be made quickly, under real pressure, and with genuine safety concerns being weighed alongside the creative and business considerations that would normally guide a decision like this. The scale of censorship that resulted from those decisions would end up being far more extensive than anything the network had applied to any previous South Park episode, including the black screen replacement used 4 years earlier during Cartoon Wars Part 2. 200 remains one of the 5 South Park episodes that Comedy Central does not air in reruns and that did not make the transition to any streaming platform the show has been available on, including Hulu, HBO Max, and now Paramount Plus. The episode is included on the physical Season 14 DVD and Blu-ray releases, though even in that format, the version included is the same censored broadcast version rather than any uncensored cut, meaning the black censor boxes covering Muhammad remain part of every officially available version of the episode that currently exists. Despite its complicated and difficult history, 200 is widely regarded by longtime viewers of the show as one of the most ambitious episodes South Park has ever produced, both in terms of the sheer number of storylines and characters it manages to bring together, and in terms of the sheer scale of real-world consequence that followed its broadcast. The episode, along with its direct follow-up, later received a nomination for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program that same year, a recognition that placed it alongside some of the most acclaimed animated television produced in 2010, despite everything that had happened in the weeks surrounding its original broadcast. Few episodes of any television show have triggered a reaction serious enough to involve law enforcement and genuine safety planning for the people who created it, and 200 stands as one of the clearest examples in television history of satire directly colliding with real-world danger in a way nobody involved in making the episode could have fully anticipated ahead of time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story that began in 200 does not resolve within this episode. The lawsuit threat from the celebrities remains unresolved, Muhammad's role in helping the town remains incomplete, and the entire situation is left hanging as the episode ends, setting up a direct continuation the following week. That continuation would end up airing under circumstances far more tense than anything the show had experienced before, with the network making decisions about censorship that went well beyond anything applied to this episode, and with Parker and Stone finding their own voices silenced within their own broadcast in a way that would become the single most talked about moment of censorship in the show's entire history. Section 5, 201, Season 14, Episode 6, 2010. South Park aired 201 on April April 21st, 2010, exactly 1 week after 200, and it remains the single most censored episode in the show's entire history. What happened between the two broadcasts changed everything about how this second episode was allowed to reach the screen, turning a planned continuation of a milestone celebration into the most tightly controlled half-hour Comedy Central had ever put its name on. The plot of 201 picks up directly where 200 left off. The town is still dealing with the group of celebrities threatening a massive lawsuit unless they can secure a meeting with Muhammad, and the story works toward resolving that thread while also tying together a long-running plot involving Cartman and the secret of his father's identity, a storyline the show had been building since much earlier in its run. The celebrity plot and the Cartman plot run alongside each other for most of the episode, with the promise of finally revealing Muhammad's role serving as the through line connecting both halves of the story together. The episode brings back an unusually large number of characters who had been absent from the show for years by that point, treating the milestone celebration begun in 200 as an opportunity to keep expanding its own cast of returning faces. Dr. Alphonse Mephisto, a mad scientist character who had not appeared on the show in roughly a decade, returns here alongside his assistant Kevin, and the episode also brings back Mr. Hanky, Big Gay Al, Mr. Slave, and Pip Purup, a character who had faded into the background of the show years earlier, and who meets an abrupt end within this episode when he is crushed underfoot during the ongoing rampage of the giant mechanical Streisand introduced in the previous episode. That rampage forms one of the episode's two central threads. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny work to counter the threat posed by the celebrities and the machine by attempting to clone Muhammad in Dr. Mephisto's laboratory, reasoning that giving both the celebrities and the rival group of children a version of him to use would defuse the standoff entirely. Meanwhile, the members of the Super Best Friends work to calm the rampaging mechanical Streisand by having the character Krishna, one of the religious figures on the team, appear disguised as the real-world singer Neil Diamond in order to perform alongside her. A strange but effective solution that temporarily halts the destruction she has been causing throughout the town. The celebrities, led by Tom Cruise, eventually gain access to a machine described within the story as capable of transferring a kind of protective essence directly from Muhammad into another person, promising whoever receives it permanent immunity from being mocked or ridiculed ever again. Cruise becomes the first person subjected to this process, and the story marks his transformation by giving him the same black sensor box that had been placed over Muhammad throughout both episodes, suggesting he has now received the same protection Muhammad appeared to carry. The Super Best Friends intervene before any additional transfers can take place, working to free Muhammad from the celebrity's custody before the process can be repeated on anyone else. The second major thread running through the episode finally resolves the long-standing mystery of Cartman's father, a question the show had first raised in its second season and reopened as a cliffhanger at the end of 200. Cartman is taken to meet Scott Tenorman, a character introduced nearly a decade earlier in a season 5 episode built entirely around Cartman engineering an elaborate act of revenge against him. Within that earlier episode, Cartman had arranged for Scott's parents to be killed and had secretly fed their remains to Scott without his knowledge, an act the show has referenced repeatedly over the years as one of the darkest and most extreme things Cartman has ever done. In 201, Scott returns as the leader of the Ginger Separatist movement, and in this confrontation, he reveals that his own father had, years earlier, had an affair with Cartman's mother, meaning that the man Cartman had killed and fed to Scott all those years ago was, in fact, Cartman's own biological father, making Cartman and Scott half-brothers. This reveal reframes the entire earlier storyline about Cartman's father, replacing the Season 2 explanation involving Cartman's mother's dual biology with a new and far darker answer, one that means the town had spent years covering up an affair connected to a local football player in order to protect the reputation of the team involved. The fighting between the celebrities, the Ginger Separatist movement, and the Super Best Friends eventually spills into the confrontation with Scott, who escapes during the chaos, promising he will return again in the future. As the fighting continues, Cruise's censor box disappears once he becomes the target of a fresh round of mockery from the people around him, demonstrating within the story that the supposed protective power granted by Muhammad's essence was never real to begin with, and that the only thing that had ever truly stopped people from mocking Muhammad was fear of violent retaliation rather than any actual protective force. Behind the scenes, the week between the two broadcasts had been anything but normal. Following the airing of 200, a group called Revolution Muslim posted a message online referencing the 2004 killing of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, who had been murdered after releasing a film that was seen as critical of how women were treated within certain interpretations of of Islam. The message listed what it described as the address of the South Park studio alongside this reference, language that law enforcement and Comedy Central both treated as a serious and credible warning rather than something to dismiss. This meant that by the time 201 was ready to air, Parker and Stone were no longer just writing a comedy episode. They were finishing a broadcast under the kind of real-world pressure very few television writers have ever had to work under. Comedy Central's response to this pressure shaped nearly every part of how 201 actually reached audiences. The most significant change involved Muhammad's appearance within the episode itself. Where 200 had shown Muhammad on screen with a black censor box placed over him, 201 went much further. Every scene involving Muhammad was edited so that he did not appear visually at all, and every mention of his name was replaced with a loud, continuous bleep sound covering the audio entirely. This meant that for anyone watching the episode without any outside context, it became difficult to even follow which character was being discussed in certain scenes, since both the image and the name were removed at the same time. The most talked about piece of censorship in the entire episode involves a closing speech given near the end of the story, delivered jointly by Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus, addressing the underlying lesson of the two-part story directly. In earlier episodes, Kyle had regularly served as the voice making a direct argument tying the episode's events back to a larger point about fear, free speech, and the dangers of giving in to threats. This pattern had been established clearly in Cartoon Wars Part 2 4 years earlier, where Kyle's closing speech was allowed to air without any interference, directly criticizing the network's own decision to censor an image just moments earlier within the same broadcast. In 201, Parker and Stone wrote a similar closing speech, intended to address the exact situation the show now found itself in, one where the fear of violence had led to an unprecedented level of self-censorship. Comedy Central chose not to air this speech in any audible form. Instead, the entire monologue was covered by a continuous bleep sound from start to finish, meaning the actual content of what was said during this moment was withheld from every viewer of the original broadcast. Parker and Stone were reportedly frustrated by how far the network's edits went, feeling that the final broadcast version distorted the intended message of the episode in a way that went beyond simple caution and into actively undermining the point the episode was trying to make. Their frustration became part of a public statement released by South Park Studios shortly after the episode aired, in which they pushed back against how the network had handled the broadcast. The statement made clear that the extensive bleeping and visual censorship had not been their creative choice, and that the final version audiences saw did not reflect what they had originally written or intended for the episode to say. This situation created a strange and layered irony similar to what had happened with Cartoon Wars 4 years earlier, but on a much larger scale. The episode was, at its core, still making an argument about the danger of giving in to fear, and the way that giving in teaches people that threats are an effective tool. By censoring the closing speech entirely, removing both the content and the ability of the audience to even hear the argument being made, Comedy Central ended up demonstrating the exact behavior the episode was built to criticize, this time in a far more visible and widely discussed way than had happened with Cartoon Wars. The show tried to make a point about silence being the wrong response to fear, and the network's response was to silence the show's own attempt to make that point. The extent of the censorship in 201 became a major news story in its own right, separate from the underlying plot of the episode itself. Media coverage in the days following the broadcast focused heavily on the bleeped speech, with many outlets reporting on the unusual sight of a long stretch of dialogue being rendered completely inaudible, something that stood out even to viewers unfamiliar with the show's earlier history involving Muhammad. This coverage turned 201 into one of the most discussed episodes in the show's history, not primarily because of its plot, but because of what had been done to prevent parts of it from being heard at all. Doug Herzog, who had also been involved in the network's decisions during the Cartoon Wars controversy in 2006, addressed the situation publicly in the aftermath, describing the choices made around 201 as necessary, given the specific and serious nature of the warning the show had received. Unlike the Cartoon Wars situation, which had involved general concern about potential backlash, the decisions around 201 were made in direct response to language that referenced an actual killing and a specific address, giving the network a much more immediate and concrete safety concern to weigh against its usual creative decisions. Within the story itself, the celebrity lawsuit plot from 200 reaches its resolution in 201, tying back into the town's attempts to use Muhammad's involvement to satisfy the group of celebrities threatening legal action. The Cartman storyline involving his father's identity also concludes within this episode, closing out a plot thread that had been building across multiple earlier seasons of the show. In the episode's final scenes, rather than react reacting with any real grief over learning the truth about his father, Cartman is shown far more upset by the discovery that this new parentage makes him part ginger, a detail Mitch Connor, the same puppet character from the previous episode, uses to comfort him by pointing out that it also makes him part of the same football lineage connected to the Denver Broncos. Tom Cruise, having lost his temporary protection from ridicule, is shown in tears, wishing for a place where he could live free of mockery, and the boys, without fully understanding the consequences of what they are offering, direct him toward the same fictional lunar paradise the show had introduced in an earlier season as the supposed destination for animals rescued from captivity. The episode closes on a final image of Cruise's body lying motionless on the surface of the moon, beside the body of a whale from that same earlier storyline. A bleak final joke closing out the two-part celebration on an unexpectedly grim note. Because so much of the episode's audio and visual content was altered before airing, some of the connective tissue between these plot threads became harder to follow in the broadcast version than it would have been in the version originally written, an additional consequence of how heavily the episode was edited before release. Critics reviewing the episode at the time generally noted this same disjointed quality, describing it as a dense collection of returning characters and rapid plot developments that rewarded longtime viewers familiar with the show's history, while still standing out as one of the most talked about episodes the series had ever produced, regardless of how its heavy censorship affected its pacing. 201 has never been rebroadcast on Comedy Central since its original airing, and it does not appear on Hulu, HBO Max, or Paramount Plus, joining 200, Cartoon Wars Part 1, Cartoon Wars Part 2, and Super Best Friends as the 5 episodes missing from the show's digital library. Unlike some of the other banned episodes, which remain available in a complete and uncensored form through physical DVD and Blu-ray releases, 201 is included on the Season 14 box set only in its heavily censored broadcast version, meaning even fans who own the physical release cannot access an uncut version of the episode through any official channel. The version most commonly available today, including on unofficial re-uploads, is the same edited broadcast that originally aired, complete with the black boxes, the continuous bleeping over Muhammad's name, and the fully silenced version of the closing speech. Years later, in early 2014, reports surfaced online describing what was said to be an uncensored version of the episode that had begun circulating outside of any official release, though this version was never distributed through any sanctioned channel and has never replaced the censored broadcast cut as the version officially available to the public. The scale of what happened around 201 marked a turning point in how Parker and Stone approached the subject of Muhammad going forward. Where Cartoon Wars in 2006 had still left room for the show to keep testing that boundary, the direct threat connected to 200 and 201 in 2010 effectively closed that door for good. South Park has not attempted a direct depiction of Muhammad in any new episode since 201 aired, and the show's later handling of religious and political figures has generally avoided returning to this specific subject in the same way it once did during its earlier seasons. Despite, or perhaps because of, everything that happened around its release, 201 is frequently cited by longtime fans and critics as one of the most important episodes in the show's history, not for how it plays as a piece of comedy, but for what it reveals about the real cost of making satire under genuine threat. Few television episodes have ever had their own closing argument silenced by the same network airing them, and the fact that this happened as a direct response to a threat referencing an actual killing gives 201 a weight that sets it apart from nearly every other controversy in the show's 27-season run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The events surrounding 200 and 201 also mark the end of a specific chapter in South Park's relationship with religious controversy, one that had begun quietly 9 years earlier with an episode nobody thought twice about and that had built steadily through Cartoon Wars in 2006 before reaching its most serious and consequential point with these two episodes in 2010. What comes next in this history moves away from religious controversy entirely toward a very different kind of banned episode, one where the reason for the ban had nothing to do with faith, threats, or global politics, and everything to do with a much smaller, much more local concern about the real-world safety of children. Section 6. An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig. Season 1, Episode 5, 1997. An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig aired as the 5th episode of South Park's very first season, arriving early in 1997 while the show was still finding its footing as a new and already talked about addition to Comedy Central's lineup. This episode stands apart from every other entry on this list twist in one important way. It is the only one of the historically altered episodes that has nothing to do with religion, a public figure, or a foreign government. Its edit traces back to a much smaller and much more local concern, one rooted in real fear about how children copy what they see on screen. The episode's main plot follows a science fair storyline, where Stan Marsh is paired with Kyle Broflovsky for a class project. Their teacher, Mr. Garrison, assigns the boys a genetics experiment, and through the course of the episode, this experiment becomes tangled up with themes the show would return to constantly in later years, including questions about where babies actually come from and how much adults are willing to lie to children rather than explain something honestly. This plotline sits at the center of the episode and gives it its title, tying back to a joke about crossbreeding animals that Cartman brings up early on. Running alongside the science fair story is a smaller subplot involving Stan's older sister, Shelley. Shelley had already been introduced in the show's earlier episodes as a recurring source of physical torment for Stan, a teenage sister who treats her younger brother with casual, repeated cruelty rather than any kind of protectiveness. This dynamic was established as a running joke from the very start of the series, showing Shelley hitting, mocking, and generally abusing Stan in ways the show played for comedy rather than drama, treating the violence the same way cartoons had treated exaggerated slapstick for decades before it. In this particular episode, the subplot involving Shelley escalates further than it had before. The version of the episode as originally written and animated included a sequence where Shelley sets Stan on fire, then puts the fire out using a bucket of water, repeating this cycle more than once over the course of the scene. This sequence was intended purely as an exaggerated piece of slapstick, following the same comedic logic the show had already applied to Shelley's earlier appearances, just pushed to a more extreme and more visually dramatic place than the simple slaps and shoves that had defined her character up to that point. Before the episode aired, Comedy Central made the decision to cut this sequence rather than broadcast it as written. The specific reasoning behind this decision traces back to a real and tragic event that had occurred a few years earlier, one that had already reshaped how television networks thought about depicting fire being used against another person, even in a clearly exaggerated cartoon context. In 1993, a 5-year-old boy in Ohio set fire to the mobile home he lived in, and the fire killed his 2-year-old sister. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the boy's mother stated publicly that her son had been influenced by the animated show Beavis and Butthead, specifically pointing to the title character's on-screen fascination with fire as something she believed her son had imitated. This claim received wide news coverage at the time and became one of the most talked about media controversies of the early 1990s, since it raised a serious and difficult question about whether cartoons showing dangerous behavior, even in a comedic or exaggerated way, could genuinely influence real children to copy that behavior in the real world. MTV, the network that aired Beavis and Butthead, responded to this controversy directly. The show was moved to a later time slot, airing further into the night in an attempt to reduce the chances of very young children watching it unsupervised. Scenes involving fire were edited or removed from future episodes and reruns, and the network became notably more cautious about how the show depicted any behavior that could plausibly be copied by young viewers watching at home. This entire episode, from the original tragedy through MTV's response, became a defining case study across the television industry about the real-world risk of children imitating dangerous behavior seen in cartoons, and it shaped how networks thought about similar content for years afterward. Comedy Central, operating under this same industry-wide caution, applied a similar standard to An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig when it reached the Shelley subplot involving fire. Rather than risk any chance of a young viewer attempting to copy what Shelley does to Stan in the scene, the network cut the sequence showing her actually setting him on fire, choosing to keep South Park from becoming connected to the same kind of tragic real-world outcome that had already been linked to Beavis and Butthead just a few years earlier. What makes this particular edit unusual compared to the other cases covered so far in this history is the way the cut was handled technically. Rather than removing the entire subplot or reworking the scene from scratch, the edit focused specifically on removing the shots showing Shelley lighting Stan on fire and repeating the process. However, remnants of the original sequence remained visible in the aired version. A puddle of water appears on the ground beneath Stan later in the scene, water that in the original unedited version was clearly shown being used to put out the fire Shelley had started. In the edited broadcast version, this puddle appears without the fire that would explain its presence, since the shots showing the actual fire being set and extinguished were removed, while the surrounding footage, including this small physical detail, stayed in place. This left an odd, slightly disjointed moment moment in the finished episode, one that attentive viewers could notice as a visible seam left behind by the edit, even without knowing the specific reasoning behind why the change had been made. This kind of leftover detail is common in television editing when a network makes a late decision to cut specific footage rather than reworking an entire scene from the ground up. Rather than reanimating the sequence to remove every trace of the original version, the simplest and fastest fix is often to cut only the most direct and explicit shots, even if this leaves small inconsistencies in the surrounding material. In the case of this episode, that approach meant the finished broadcast carried a small, visible reminder of what had originally been there, a puddle with no clear origin, standing as a quiet marker of the edit made before the episode ever reached television screens. The broader context surrounding this decision says something important about the television landscape South Park was born into. The show debuted in August of 1997, at a moment when animated adult comedy was still a relatively new and untested category on American television. The Simpsons had already proven that animation could carry adult-oriented humor and sustain a long-running series, having debuted in 1989 and grown into one of the most successful shows on television by the time South Park arrived. Beavis and Butthead had proven something different, showing that adult animated comedy could be far cruder, far more chaotic, and far more directly aimed at younger audiences who related to two barely competent teenage characters, even while carrying an adult rating meant to signal it was not intended for children in the first place. South Park arrived into this landscape carrying some of the same tension that had already defined Beavis and Butthead's history. Both shows used crude, exaggerated humor, and both attracted large numbers of younger viewers despite being explicitly intended for a mature audience. Networks airing this kind of content were already sensitive to the possibility that young viewers, drawn to the show's humor and style regardless of its intended rating, might not fully separate the exaggerated cartoon violence they were watching from real-world consequences. The tragedy connected to Beavis and Butthead had already demonstrated, in the most serious way possible, that this concern was not just theoretical. Comedy Central's decision to cut the fire scene from An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig reflects a network applying a lesson it had already watched play out at a rival channel just a few years earlier, choosing caution over risk with a new show that shared some of the same core audience concerns. This episode's history also stands out because, unlike every other entry on this list, its edit was never really connected to any organized public campaign or outside pressure group demanding a change. There was no religious organization involved, no foreign government reaction, and no direct threat made against the show's creators. The decision came from within the network itself, made proactively based on a real-world tragedy from a completely different show, rather than in reaction to backlash directed at South Park specifically. This makes An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig a genuinely different kind of case within this history, one driven by a network trying to avoid a repeat of a tragedy, rather than one responding to anger already directed at the episode itself. The main science fair plot of the episode, involving Stan and Kyle's genetics project and Mr. Garrison's increasingly complicated attempts to explain reproduction to his students without giving a direct or honest answer, was left largely untouched by the network's edit. This means the episode's central storyline survived intact, and the edit applied specifically and narrowly to the smaller Shelley subplot running alongside it. This distinction matters because it shows the network was not treating the entire episode as a problem. The concern was isolated to one specific, physically dangerous behavior depicted in one specific scene, rather than reflecting any broader discomfort with the episode's tone or subject matter as a whole. An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig has never been included in any of the streaming platforms that have carried South Park's library, including Hulu, HBO Max, and now Paramount+. Its absence places it alongside Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars Part 1, Cartoon Wars Part 2, 200, and 201 as one of the handful of episodes commonly cited as banned or missing from the show's modern digital footprint, even though the underlying reason for its absence has nothing to do with the religious controversies driving the other 5 cases. The episode does remain available through physical media, appearing on the Season 1 DVD release in the same edited form that originally aired on Comedy Central, meaning the version most commonly seen by fans today, whether through physical copies or older recordings, already reflects the cut made before the episode's original 1997 broadcast. This episode's place in South Park's history offers a useful contrast to everything covered earlier in this history, where Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars, and the 200th episode saga were all shaped by outside pressure, religious sensitivity, international politics, and in the most serious cases, direct threats of violence against the show's creators. An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig was shaped by something much smaller and and much more preventable. A network trying to learn from a tragedy that had already happened to someone else. It stands as proof that not every edit in South Park's history came from fear of backlash or fear of controversy. Some came from a far simpler and more human concern, one focused entirely on keeping young viewers safe from copying something dangerous they saw on a cartoon, regardless of how unlikely that outcome may have seemed to the writers who first put the scene on paper. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of South Park's censorship history does not stay confined to domestic decisions made by Comedy Central alone. Beyond the edits made for American broadcast, the show has also run into a completely different set of obstacles overseas, where entire governments, rather than a single network, have made the decision to block episodes from being seen at all. Section 7, Banned in China, Season 23, Episode 2, 2019. Banned in China aired on October 2nd, 2019 as the second episode of South Park's 23rd season and the 299th episode of the show overall. By this point, South Park had been running for more than 2 decades, and the show had already built a long history of taking aim at governments, media companies, and public figures without much apparent fear of consequences. This particular episode became the reason the entire show, all 22 prior seasons and everything that came after, was pulled from the internet across an entire country, making it one of the most far-reaching acts of censorship the show has ever triggered. The episode's plot centers on Randy Marsh, who runs a legal marijuana business on his family farm called Tegrity Farms. After hearing about how large the Chinese market is, Randy decides to travel to China, hoping to expand his business there. He brings marijuana with him on the trip without checking whether it is legal in the country, and Chinese airport security arrests him almost immediately after he lands, sending him to a prison camp. While locked up, Randy meets 2 other prisoners who are, within the world of the episode, treated as real inmates rather than cartoon characters visiting from another franchise. These 2 prisoners are Winnie the Pooh and his friend Piglet, both drawn directly from the classic children's characters created by author A.A. Milne nearly a century earlier, and long associated with the Disney Company through decades of films, merchandise, and theme park attractions built around them. Within the episode, Winnie the Pooh and Piglet are shown imprisoned because Chinese officials consider Pooh's image offensive, tied to a real-world comparison between the character's rounded shape and the physical appearance of Chinese President Xi Jinping. This comparison did not originate with South Park. It began years earlier as an online joke circulating among Chinese internet users, who noticed a resemblance between photographs of Xi Jinping and the visual design of Winnie the Pooh. The joke spread widely enough across Chinese social media that the government eventually moved to suppress it, and by 2017, references to Winnie the Pooh had reportedly become subject to restriction on some Chinese platforms as a result. This restriction escalated further in 2018 when Disney's live-action film Christopher Robin, built around the Winnie the Pooh characters, was blocked from release in Chinese theaters entirely, a decision widely understood to be connected to the ongoing comparison to the country's leader. South Park's writers built the entire prison storyline directly on top of this real and well-documented sequence of events, using Pooh and Piglet's imprisonment as a way to dramatize a genuine act of government censorship that had already been reported on by international news outlets before the episode ever aired. Running alongside Randy's storyline in China, the episode follows a second plot involving his son Stan, who plays in a death metal band with his friends called Crimson Dawn. A music producer approaches the band about the possibility of a biographical film covering their story, following a trend of successful real-world musician biopics that had come out in the years leading up to this episode, including films about musicians like Elton John and Freddie Mercury. As discussions about the movie continue, Stan and his bandmates learn that in order for the film to be approved for release in China, one of the largest and most valuable markets in the world for American entertainment, certain elements of their story will need to be removed or changed to satisfy Chinese government censorship rules. This subplot allows the episode to satirize a real and widely reported practice within the American entertainment industry, where studios have increasingly altered scripts, cast choices, and story details specifically to avoid losing access to Chinese theatrical release, given how much revenue that market can generate for a major film. The episode brings these 2 storylines together through the character of Mickey Mouse, who appears within the story as a business figure representing Disney's own interests in maintaining access to the Chinese market. Mickey confronts Randy directly over the trouble he believes Randy is causing with his criticism of China's treatment of Pooh, worried that the controversy could threaten Disney's own business relationship with Chinese officials. Randy in turn makes the decision to personally kill Winnie the Pooh within the story, strangling the character in a dark alley as Piglet watches, an act framed as an attempt attempt to remove the source of tension between Pooh's continued existence and China's willingness to do business with Randy and Mickey going forward. The episode plays the scene with a level of graphic detail that stands out even by South Park's own standards for dark humor, presenting the killing of a beloved children's character with genuine visual weight rather than treating it as a quick, cartoonish gag. By the end of the episode, Stan ultimately refuses to let the planned biopic about his band be altered to satisfy Chinese censorship demands, choosing instead to walk away from the deal entirely rather than compromise the story he wants to tell. This decision stands in direct contrast to Randy's choice earlier in the episode, where Randy is shown killing Pooh specifically in order to preserve a profitable business arrangement with Chinese officials. The episode closes by showing Tegrity Weed has become legal for sale in China, with a truck delivering a large sum of cash to the family farm as a direct result of the deal Randy secured. Stan, upon learning what his father did to make this deal possible, reacts with quiet disappointment rather than shock, choosing to walk away and write another song about his father rather than confront him directly. This final contrast between Randy's willingness to compromise for profit and Stan's refusal to do the same for his own art forms the emotional backbone of the episode's satire, using two generations within the same family to represent two very different responses to the same pressure. The episode also includes a storyline involving Randy addressing a tribunal of Chinese officials, where he argues that America operates with a level of integrity that China's system does not share. A speech delivered with the kind of confident, self-assured tone the show frequently gives to Randy, even when his own behavior contradicts what he is saying. This scene sits alongside the episode's broader commentary on how large American companies, including major film studios and entertainment brands, have increasingly shaped their products around the preferences and restrictions of Chinese censors in exchange for access to hundreds of millions of potential customers, a business reality that had already been reported on extensively by entertainment journalists in the years before this episode aired. The real-world reaction to Banned in China arrived almost immediately after its broadcast, and it escalated with unusual speed even by the standards of a show that had triggered international controversy before. Within days of the episode airing, reports began circulating that South Park content was being systematically removed from Chinese internet platforms, including major search engines and social media sites operating within the country. Clips, episodes, discussion forums, and fan pages related to the show were reportedly scrubbed from the Chinese internet almost entirely, effectively cutting off access to the show for viewers inside the country through any official or widely used channel. This response went well beyond banning a single episode. Unlike the domestic censorship battles South Park had faced over specific episodes involving Muhammad, where individual broadcasts were blocked while the rest of the show's library remained untouched, the reaction in China affected the show's entire back catalog at once, removing over 2 decades of episodes from circulation within the country in a very short period of time. Trey Parker and Matt Stone responded to this reaction with a public statement released through the show's official channels just days after the ban took effect. The statement was written in a heavily sarcastic tone, framed as a mock apology directed at the Chinese government, deliberately mimicking the kind of statement other major companies had issued in the past when trying to smooth over disputes with Chinese officials in order to protect their own business interests. The statement specifically referenced an unrelated but closely timed controversy involving the National Basketball Association, whose general manager for the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, had posted a message online expressing support for pro-democracy protests taking place in Hong Kong at the time. That post had triggered a significant business backlash from Chinese partners and broadcasters connected to the NBA, leading the league into its own public struggle over how much to accommodate Chinese pressure while still defending its employees' right to speak freely. Parker and Stone's statement drew a direct line between this NBA situation and their own new conflict with Chinese censors, using the comparison to point out what they saw as a pattern of major American companies bending toward Chinese government preferences whenever enough money was on the line. This response fit naturally within the show's decades-long identity, using satire aimed outward at real institutions, even in its own official statements addressing a real-world controversy, rather than issuing a conventional or fully serious apology. The mock statement quickly circulated across entertainment news coverage, becoming almost as widely discussed as the episode itself, and it reinforced the same argument the episode had already made through its story, that companies frequently choose profit over principle when dealing with Chinese market access, regardless of what public statements about values or integrity they might otherwise make. The controversy surrounding Banned in China also connected to a small act of public protest that took place shortly after the ban was put in place. On the night of October 8, 2019, the episode was reportedly screened publicly on a street in Hong Kong's Sham Shui Po district, shown to a crowd gathered outdoors as a form of protest tied to the broader pro-democracy demonstrations happening throughout Hong Kong at that time. This screening turned the episode into more than just a piece of entertainment controversy, connecting it directly to real political tension already unfolding in the region regarding Hong Kong's relationship with mainland Chinese authority. Unlike the episodes covered earlier in this history, Banned in China remains fully available on every official platform South Park is normally streamed through in the United States and most other countries, including Paramount+. Its ban applies specifically to China, where the episode itself, along with the rest of the show's library, remains blocked from official access as of this recording. This makes Banned in China a distinct kind of entry within South Park's censorship history, one where the show was not edited, cut, or altered in any way for its original broadcast, but instead triggered an entire country choosing to remove access to the show altogether rather than ask for any specific change to the episode's content. The episode stands as one of the clearest examples in the show's history of South Park using a real, specific, and well-documented act of government censorship as the direct subject of an episode, only to become the target of nearly identical censorship in response. Just as Cartoon Wars had turned into a real demonstration of the same media cowardice it was satirizing, and just as 201's own censorship had mirrored the argument the episode itself was trying to make, Banned in China became a live example of exactly the kind of institutional capitulation to Chinese pressure that the episode was built to criticize, playing out in real time against the show itself rather than against Disney, the NBA, or any of the other companies named within its story. This pattern of South Park episodes about censorship becoming real examples of censorship almost immediately after airing connects Banned in China directly back to the two hottest and most serious controversies covered earlier in this history, even though the actual government and audience involved were entirely different. What began with a Danish newspaper controversy in 2005 and escalated through direct threats against the show's creators in 2010 had, by 2019, expanded into a new and different kind of consequence entirely. One measured not in death threats or broadcast bleeps, but in an entire national ban applied instantly and completely, reaching every episode the show had ever made rather than just the one that caused it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of South Park's history with international censorship does not end with China. Nearly 2 decades earlier, a much smaller and much less internationally reported ban had already played out in a different country entirely, one connected not to a government leader's public image, but to a Jewish community's response to a single episode's portrayal of their own history and culture. Section 8, Jubilee, Season 3, Episode 9, 1999. Jubilee aired on July 28, 1999, as the 9th episode of South Park's 3rd season and the 40th episode of the series overall. It arrived at a specific and telling moment in the show's production history, airing about a month after the theatrical release of South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. The feature film Trey Parker and Matt Stone had just spent an enormous amount of energy finishing. This episode became one of the clearest cases in South Park's history, where an episode built with almost no serious intention behind it ended up triggering a real government-level broadcast ban in another part of the world. The story follows Kyle Broflovsky and his younger brother Ike as they prepare to attend Jubilee, a summer camp modeled on Boy Scout traditions but built specifically for Jewish children. Kyle's parents, Gerald and Sheila, are heading out to a separate party the same night, one built around a meteor shower passing through South Park, a plot thread connecting this episode to 2 other stories airing around the same time as part of what fans commonly call the Meteor Shower Trilogy. Before leaving, Kyle invites his friend Kenny McCormick to come along to the camp, despite Kenny not being Jewish, and Kenny insists he can act Jewish well enough to fit in for the night. At the camp, the story splits the characters into 2 groups based on age. Older boys, including Kyle and Kenny, are grouped into what the episode calls the Jew Scouts, while younger children, including Ike, join a group called the Squirts. The episode plays out a series of exaggerated camp activities within these 2 groups, including an initiation ritual, arts and crafts projects built around Jewish tradition, and a nightly ceremony where the campers summon the biblical figure Moses, who appears in the episode as a large, glowing, floating dreidel rather than as a traditional human figure. Kenny takes part in these same rituals throughout the night, working to keep his non-Jewish background hidden from the camp leaders and fellow scouts around him. The episode's central conflict introduces a villain drawn from the Book of Esther, a text found in the Hebrew Bible and connected closely to the Jewish holiday of Purim. This villain is Haman, a historical antagonist within Jewish religious tradition, remembered for plotting to destroy the Jewish people, an event the holiday of Purim traditionally commemorates surviving. Within the episode, a splinter group of campers is shown worshipping Haman rather than rejecting him, framed by the story as a strange and misguided sect operating on the fringes of the main camp community. This group works throughout the episode toward a plan to free Haman and use him to gain control over the other campers, setting up the story's climax around stopping that plan before it succeeds. Kenny ends up playing a central role in resolving this conflict. After being exposed as not Jewish and cast out of the main ceremony, Kenny wanders into the surrounding woods, where he stumbles onto the details of the Haman worshippers' plan and works with the younger squirts to get back to the camp and stop it before real harm is done. The episode resolves with Moses defeating Haman directly, freeing the captured campers, and restoring order to Jubilee before the night ends. Parker and Stone have described the making of this specific episode in unusually candid terms during commentary released alongside the show's Season 3 DVD release. Both creators have explained that Jubilee was the final episode they needed to finish before taking a long overdue break following the exhausting production schedule of their feature film. Rather than agonizing over the script the way they might have for other episodes, they made a deliberate decision to write something loose, strange, and largely free of any careful message, treating the entire episode as an opportunity to just have fun rather than build toward any specific point. Despite, or perhaps because of, this relaxed approach, both creators have said in interviews that they came away from Jubilee considering it one of the strongest episodes the show had produced up to that point, an experience that reportedly helped shape how they approached writing scripts for the show going forward, leaning more on instinct and less on heavily engineered plotting. This background matters because it stands in direct contrast to how the episode was eventually received overseas. In the United States, Jubilee aired without triggering any significant public backlash, moving through Comedy Central's normal broadcast rotation the same way most other episodes from this era of the show did. The episode has remained available on every official platform carrying South Park's library in the years since, including its inclusion in the complete third season DVD release in 2003 and the corresponding Blu-ray release in 2017, and it continues to stream today as part of the show's full catalog on Paramount+. The reaction in parts of Eastern Europe told a very different story. In Romania, the National Audiovisual Council, the country's official body responsible for regulating broadcast content, made the decision to ban South Park from Romanian television starting in the year 2000, specifically citing Jubilee as an episode the council considered deeply anti-Semitic. This decision followed direct protests from members of Romania's Jewish community, who raised concerns about how the episode handled Jewish religious tradition and imagery, given the sensitivity surrounding jokes about Jewish identity in a country with its own complicated history connected to the treatment of Jewish citizens during the 20th century. The ban applied to the entire South Park series rather than to this single episode alone, meaning Romanian broadcasters were prevented from airing any part of the show following the council's decision, not just the specific episode that triggered the complaint. This ban remained in place for several years before South Park eventually found its way back onto Romanian television. The show first returned to the country through MTV Romania beginning in 2008, nearly a decade after the original ban took effect, before later moving to Comedy Central Romania starting in 2016, where it has continued airing since. Some seasons of the show have also become available to Romanian audiences through Netflix in more recent years, giving viewers in the country multiple paths to access the series today, despite its earlier decade-long absence from Romanian airwaves. A separate, connected story played out in Hungary around the same underlying concern. HBO Hungary, which held broadcasting rights to South Park in the country during this period, made the decision not to air Jubilee at all when the network first began broadcasting the series, choosing to skip the episode entirely rather than risk a negative reaction from Hungary's Jewish community, whose history includes some of the darkest chapters of the Holocaust carried out on Hungarian soil during the Second World War. Rather than airing the episode with any kind of edit or warning, HBO Hungary simply left it out of rotation, a quieter form of censorship than Romania's formal government ban, but one rooted in the same underlying concern about how the episode's content might be received. This informal ban remained in place for years until the show moved to a different Hungarian broadcaster, Cool TV, which lifted the restriction and aired Jubilee for the first time in the country on December 2nd, 2005, finally giving Hungarian audiences official access to an episode that had quietly sat outside the show's normal broadcast rotation for years. What makes Jubilee a genuinely distinct case within South Park's broader censorship history is the gap between how the episode was made, and how seriously parts of the world ended up treating it. Parker and Stone have been open that the episode was written quickly, loosely, and without any deep intention behind its jokes about Jewish tradition, describing the entire process as an almost carefree afterthought, following months of much heavier work on their film. Despite this, the episode's content, particularly its handling of Jewish religious imagery and its inclusion of an anti-Semitic villain drawn from ancient religious history, was serious enough to trigger an actual government broadcast ban in one country and a voluntary, quiet, years-long omission from another network's schedule in a second country entirely. Few episodes in the show's history demonstrate this particular gap as clearly, where the intention behind an episode's creation and the real-world seriousness of its reception ended up sitting so far apart from each other. It is also worth noting, in the interest of full accuracy, that Kyle himself is Jewish within the world of South Park, and the episode's satire is built specifically around Kyle's own community and background rather than aimed at Judaism from an outside perspective. This detail matters because it places Jubilee alongside a broader pattern the show has followed throughout its run, one where Parker and Stone have generally applied their harshest and most exaggerated jokes evenly across many different religious and cultural groups, including groups the creators themselves belong to or have close personal ties to. Whether or not this pattern justifies the specific content of Jubilee to any given viewer, it does provide useful context for understanding why the episode was written the way it was, and why its creators were reportedly surprised by how seriously certain governments and broadcasters ended up treating a story they had built almost entirely as a lighthearted, low-stakes way to close out a long and exhausting production schedule. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of South Park's international censorship history does not stop with religious sensitivity in Eastern Europe. Elsewhere in the world, entirely different governments have drawn their own lines around the show for reasons connected not to religion at all, but to the direct mockery of specific living or recently deceased political leaders, a pattern that would eventually connect South Park's history of banned content to one of the most tightly controlled media environments on the planet. Section 9. Chinpokomon, Season 3, Episode 11, 1999. Chinpokomon aired on November 3rd, 1999 as the 11th episode of South Park's third season and the 42nd episode of the series overall. It arrived exactly 1 week before the American theatrical release of Pokémon, the first movie, a piece of timing that gave the episode a sharp real-world edge, since it landed right in the middle of one of the biggest media crazes of the late 90s. Where the episodes covered earlier in this history triggered bans and censorship tied to religion or political sensitivity, this episode became one of the show's earliest examples of a foreign government reacting to how South Park handled national identity and historical memory. The episode's plot centers on a fictional media franchise called Chinpokomon, built as a direct parody of the real Pokemon franchise, which had exploded into a massive global phenomenon among children by the time this episode aired. The kids of South Park become completely consumed by the Chinpokomon craze, buying merchandise, watching the show, and playing video games connected to the brand, mirroring the exact kind of consumer behavior real children were displaying around Pokemon at that same moment in American pop culture. Kyle Broflovsky is shown as reluctant to join the trend at first, only getting pulled in once he realizes that resisting the fads socially isolates him from his friends, a dynamic the episode uses to comment on how peer pressure drives this kind of mass consumer behavior among children, regardless of what the specific product actually is. As the story develops, the show reveals a much darker layer hidden underneath the toy craze. Within the plot, the company producing Chinpokomon is secretly using the cartoon, its merchandise, and an official Chinpokomon summer camp as tools to train and brainwash American children into becoming soldiers for the Japanese government, all building toward a second attack on Pearl Harbor. Emperor Hirohito, sharing his name directly with the real historical emperor of Japan who held the position during World War II, appears within the episode as the figure secretly guiding this entire plan from within the fictional company producing the toys and cartoon. The adults of South Park eventually catch on to what is happening and manage to stop the children before the fictional attack takes place, using a strategy where the parents pretend to like Chinpokomon themselves, correctly guessing that their children will instantly lose interest in anything their parents openly approve of. This plot placed Emperor Hirohito, a real historical figure who led Japan through the Second World War and remained a deeply significant and, for many Japanese citizens, respected figure well beyond that era, directly at the center of a joke about war crimes, brainwashing, and a second Pearl Harbor attack carried out through children's toys toys. Hirohito served as Emperor of Japan from 1926 until his death in 1989, meaning he had been dead for a full decade by the time this episode used his name and likeness for a fictional villain plotting a second Pearl Harbor attack against the United States. His reign spanned the entirety of Japan's involvement in World War II, including the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, an event that drew the United States directly into the war and remains one of the most significant moments in 20th century American and Japanese history alike. The episode's reception in Japan reflected the seriousness of using a real, historically significant figure this way. According to reporting on the episode's international history, Shin Pokemon was pulled from Japan's Wow Wow Network schedule and left out of the Japanese home video release of the show, following backlash from Nintendo of Japan, the company behind the real Pokemon franchise being parodied, as well as objections from right-wing groups within the country who took specific issue with how the episode handled Hirohito and the Pearl Harbor references. Nintendo's concerns reportedly centered on how the episode portrayed its newly successful global franchise, treating Pokemon's real-world merchandising success as something closer to a sinister marketing scheme built on subliminal messaging, a portrayal the company was unhappy to see attached to its brand at the exact moment Pokemon was becoming one of the most valuable media properties in the world. The separate objections from Japanese right-wing groups centered specifically on the episode's treatment of Hirohito and its Pearl Harbor plot, subjects tied closely to Japan's own complicated national memory of the Second World War and its aftermath. Beyond Shin Pokemon itself, this same underlying sensitivity around World War II related content led to several additional South Park episodes being kept out of Japanese broadcast and home video release over the years. According to reporting on the show's international censorship history, other episodes withheld from Japanese audiences for similar reasons have included a two-part story dealing heavily with Christianity, a religion with a relatively small presence in Japan compared to much of the Western world, along with a later episode continuing some of the same religious and cultural references first raised in Shin Pokemon. This pattern suggests that Japanese broadcasters applied a fairly consistent standard over time, generally avoiding South Park content that leaned heavily on either World War II era references connected to Japan specifically, or religious material built around traditions unfamiliar to most Japanese audiences. Junichi Nishimura, a real animator and former college roommate of Trey Parker, who had been involved in the show's early production, provided the voice for Emperor Hirohito within the episode. Nishimura's real connection to the show's creators is reflected elsewhere in South Park as well, since Japanese characters appearing throughout the series have frequently been given the name Nishimura or Junichi as a recurring nod to him, a detail confirming that the choice to cast him in this specific role connected back to a genuine personal relationship between Parker and Nishimura, rather than being an arbitrary casting decision. The episode's broader satire extends beyond its Japan-specific content into a wider commentary on fads, consumerism, and how easily both children and adults can be swept into mass behavior driven by marketing rather than by any real understanding of what they are consuming. The Shin Pokemon video game featured within the episode includes a level built around reenacting the Pearl Harbor attack, a detail the episode uses to underline just how far the fictional company's brainwashing effort has gone, hiding a genuine act of historical violence inside what looks, on the surface, like an ordinary children's video game. This layer of the story gave the episode a level of technical detail about how embedded messaging in children's media might theoretically work, tying its satire to real, ongoing conversations happening in the United States at the time about hidden messaging and marketing aimed at children through cartoons and toy lines. Despite the controversy surrounding its handling of Hirohito and Pearl Harbor, Shin Pokemon has been recognized by television critics and longtime fans as one of the sharper pieces of satire from the show's early seasons, specifically for how directly and quickly it responded to a real cultural phenomenon that was still unfolding in real time when the episode aired. The episode received an Emmy Award nomination the following year, reflecting the level of craft and cultural relevance industry voters recognized in the episode, despite its more difficult subject matter. This nomination stands as a useful marker of how the same episode could be treated as a serious creative achievement within the American television industry, while simultaneously being pulled from broadcast entirely in another country over concerns about how it handled that same country's national history. Shin Pokemon remains available today on every official platform currently streaming South Park's full library in the United States, including Paramount Plus, and it has not been subject to any of the domestic bans or edits applied to episodes covered earlier in this history. Its absence from circulation applies specifically to Japan, where the underlying sensitivity around Hirohito and Pearl Harbor has kept the episode out of official broadcast and home video release in the years since it first aired, even as the episode continues to be studied and referenced by fans and critics elsewhere in the world as one of the show's most direct and well-timed pieces of pop culture satire. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This entry closes out the international side of South Park's censorship history covered in this rundown, moving from religious sensitivity in the Middle East and Eastern Europe through celebrity anger and threats of violence in the United States, and now into a case built entirely around national memory and the treatment of a historical wartime figure in Japan. What remains is a final chapter in this history, one that returns closer to home, where a single broadcast decision made in the days immediately following a real and shocking act of political violence shows that even now, more than 2 decades into the show's run, South Park continues to test the exact same boundary between satire and real-world consequence that has defined its entire history. Section 10, Gotta Nut, Season 27, Episode 2, 2025. Gotta Nut premiered on August 6, 2025, as the second episode of South Park's 27th season and the 330th episode of the series overall. It stands apart from every other case covered in this history because it is the most recent, and because the events that turned it into a pulled episode unfolded not years or decades after its release, but within the span of a single month, tied to a real and shocking act of violence that had nothing to do with the show's own decisions or intentions. The episode's plot follows Clyde Donovan, a longtime background character among the South Park kids, as he starts a podcast to help cover his monthly expenses. Clyde's podcast quickly draws attention by expressing right-wing political views mixed with anti-Semitic and misogynistic commentary, a portrayal built to satirize a certain style of young, online political commentary that had grown widely popular in real-life media in the years leading up to this episode. Eric Cartman, upon seeing Clyde's podcast succeed, becomes furious that another kid has taken an approach to public commentary he feels belongs to him. After a live show at school, Cartman physically confronts Clyde and takes over the podcast for himself, adopting a style built around hosting public debates with callers, a format he refers to within the episode as master debating. Cartman's version of this podcast character is built as a direct parody of Charlie Kirk, a real conservative political commentator and founder of the organization Turning Point USA, an organization built around promoting conservative political values among young people and college students. Kirk had built a large public platform in real life, partly through recorded debates with college students on political and social issues, a format widely shared online and often centered on Kirk directly challenging students to defend their political positions in front of a camera. Cartman's version of this character within the episode adopts Kirk's general speaking style, hairstyle, and format, using the same basic setup of debating unprepared students while editing the footage afterward to remove any exchanges where the other side argues back effectively. A second storyline running through the episode follows Mr. Mackey, the longtime school counselor character, after he loses his job due to federal budget cuts. Searching for new work, Mackey takes a position with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, commonly known as ICE, the real federal agency responsible for enforcing immigration law within the United States. This storyline is built to satirize the immigration enforcement policies of the second Trump presidential administration, which had ramped up ICE operations significantly by the time this episode aired, a real-world policy shift that had already become a major subject of national news coverage and political debate throughout 2025. Both storylines converge by the end of the episode. Clyde wins an award referred to within the story as the Charlie Kirk Award for Young Master Debaters, a fictional honor that includes a prize trip to Mar-a-Lago, the private club and residence owned by President Donald Trump in Florida. Mackey's own performance within ICE earns him a bonus and eventually a meeting with President Trump at the same location, where Trump offers him a promotion connected to the Department of Homeland Security. These plot threads tie the episode's satire of online political commentary directly to its satire of immigration enforcement policy, using both storylines to comment on different aspects of the same broader political moment in the United States during 2025. Before any real-world tragedy became connected to this episode, Charlie Kirk himself publicly reacted to being parodied within it, and his reaction was notably positive rather than defensive. Kirk described being lampooned by South Park as something close to a badge of honor, framing the parody as proof of how much cultural reach his political movement had achieved by that point. He specifically praised the way Cartman's version of his character was written, calling the portrayal genuinely funny rather than objecting to how the show handled his public image. This reaction is well documented through interviews Kirk gave shortly after the episode aired, and it stands in stark contrast to how several earlier public figures covered in this history, including Tom Cruise, reportedly responded to being satirized by the same show. Everything about this episode's public reception changed on September 10th, 2025. On that day, Charlie Kirk was shot and killed while speaking at an event during his American Comeback Tour at Utah Valley University, an event organized through his organization, Turning Point USA. Kirk was 31 years old at the time of his death. Authorities investigating the shooting characterized it as a targeted attack, and the case drew involvement from federal investigators given the scale and seriousness of a political assassination carried out in a public setting on a college campus. In the immediate aftermath of Kirk's killing, a wave of reaction spread rapidly across social media and news coverage, including from a number of Kirk's supporters within his own political movement, some of whom argued that satire aimed at Kirk, including South Park's portrayal of him through Cartman, had contributed to a cultural climate that led to his death. Statements circulating in the hours after the shooting suggested a connection between comedic mockery of Kirk and the violence that ultimately killed him, an argument that gained enough traction in certain circles to become part of the broader news coverage surrounding his death. Comedy Central responded to this situation within a single day. On September 10th, 2025, the same day Kirk was killed, the network pulled a scheduled rerun of Got a Nut from its cable broadcast lineup, choosing not to air the episode again in its normal rotation going forward. This decision was confirmed directly by sources close to the show, who stated clearly that Comedy Central would not be airing the episode in what they described as the linear rotation, referring to the network's traditional live cable broadcast schedule, as opposed to on-demand or streaming access. Despite this change to the cable rerun schedule, the episode was explicitly confirmed to remain fully available through other means, including Comedy Central's on-demand service, Paramount Plus, and YouTube TV, meaning the episode was never removed from streaming or made fully inaccessible the way the 5 long-term banned episodes covered earlier in this history had been. This distinction matters for understanding exactly what kind of ban this represents compared to everything else covered so far. Unlike Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2, 200 and 201, all 5 of which were pulled entirely from every streaming platform carrying the show, Got a Nut was only removed from Comedy Central's cable rerun schedule specifically. It continued streaming without interruption on Paramount Plus and remained accessible through other platforms throughout this entire situation. This makes it a narrower and more limited form of censorship than the historic Muhammad-related bans, closer in spirit to a network simply choosing not to air a specific rerun at a sensitive moment, rather than removing the episode from circulation altogether. Following Comedy Central's decision, a producer connected to The Charlie Kirk Show, Andrew Colvett, publicly asked the network to reinstate the episode into its rotation, pointing out that Kirk himself had genuinely enjoyed the parody while he was alive, and arguing that Kirk would have wanted the episode to remain part of the show's normal broadcast schedule, rather than being pulled in response to his death. This request highlighted an unusual tension at the center of the entire situation, since the person the episode was built to mock had, in his own words, embraced the joke before his death, even as parts of his political movement afterward argued the same joke had contributed to the atmosphere that led to his killing. Got a Nut stands as a genuinely different kind of case within this history for one more important reason. Every other episode covered in this rundown was pulled or censored because of concern over the content itself, whether that content involved a religious figure, a foreign government sensitivity, or a real-world tragedy the show's own content was blamed for inspiring, as with the fire scene removed from An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig decades earlier. Got a Nut was different. The episode's content did not change at all between its original airing in August and its removal from cable reruns in September. What changed was an entirely unrelated event, a real assassination that recontextualized an existing piece of satire after the fact, turning a parody the subject himself had welcomed into a piece of content the network suddenly considered too sensitive to keep airing in its normal rotation. This entire situation unfolded within a single news cycle, a sharp contrast to cases like Cartoon Wars or the Jubilee bans in Romania and Hungary, which took years to develop and resolve. It also stands apart from the historic 5 banned episodes in one final and important way. As of this recording, Got a Nut has not been permanently or fully removed from any major streaming service, and Comedy Central's decision applies specifically to its cable rerun schedule, schedule rather than to the episode's overall availability. Whether this decision remains permanent, or whether the episode eventually returns to Comedy Central's normal rotation, the way South Park itself eventually returned to Romanian and Hungarian television decades after those earlier bans, remains an open question that only time and Comedy Central's future scheduling decisions will answer. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.